The guests for this month's conversation are Julie Grossman and Will Scheibel, authors of the book Twin Peaks, which is part of the TV Milestone series. It's a slim but densely packed and comprehensive survey of all three seasons, and it includes chapters on the production history and the Lynch Frost partnership, the show's relationship to TV and film genres like soap opera, melodrama, noir, the women of the story in light of the femme fatale archetype, the performances of Ray Wise, Kyle MacLachlan, and Cheryl Lee, and the paratexts, works like Fire Walk with Me and The Secret Diary, which add to the show from outside of its TV format. I'll let the authors themselves explain the book as we move into a wide ranging conversation, split, as always, between a public part here on YouTube, about a half hour, and then a longer back section exclusive to my $5 a month Patreon tier. That one runs almost an hour just on its own. But before we get to that discussion, I want to update the audience on my own work. Since publishing the last conversation with Laura's Ghost author Courtney Stallings back in February, I've concluded two written series on my site. One is on the Olympic documentaries, with the final entry taking us back to the origin of the modern Summer Games and up to the most recent Winter Games. And then the other series is the Mad Men Viewing Diary, which I wrapped up after years covering every episode with the last few episodes a few weeks ago. I also finished sharing my Fire Walk with Me coverage for the Lost in Twin Peaks podcast with all patrons. Those episodes will be made available to the public in a couple months. And also on my Patreon for $1 a month patrons, I released an episode covering some film capsules on movies that I'd watched recently, including like a 5 or 6 minute discussion, not a full review, but some thoughts on the film Don't Look Up, and also political reflections on the war in Ukraine and the state of the left and all not particularly uplifting subjects. But if you want to hear that, that's on my Patreon podcast, along with some podcast recommendations of stuff I've been listening to and archive reading of a review I wrote years ago for Wolf of Wall Street. So this was sort of a catch up for me of things that I'd been meaning to keep track of on my Patreon podcast, but hadn't. In addition to that, my public Twin Peaks Cinema podcast wrapped up the Small Town Blues series by discussing Peyton Place, and my public Lost in the Movies podcast launched Darren Aronofsky's short little mini series on some of his early films, starting with Pi this month. Things will be quiet on my site for the next month and a half or so as I continue to release my monthly podcasts, all of which have already been finished ahead of time, but otherwise I'll be building a backlog behind the scenes that I'll release later. This will include Lost in Twin Peaks podcasts on season 3 for the 5th anniversary of each episode this summer, and hopefully a resumption of my long delayed Twin Peaks character series, with screen time rankings and in-depth written entries on all of the major characters of the show. And possibly even, depending how those higher priority projects go, I may even return to my Unseen series in which I dive into popular films that I haven't watched before, one per year stretching back into history. So at this point I've gone back to 2013, but I would pick up in 2012 and move back from there. So all of that will wait till May for publication at the earliest, but I'll be sure to offer an update on how it's all going in my next intro to a Twin Peaks Conversations. But for now, let's kick off this discussion. Welcome to Twin Peaks Conversations. I just want you guys to start off by telling us about your book, Twin Peaks, part of the TV Milestone series. What inspired you to write it, and where, how that project unfolded. You did tell me before we started recording that you got to launch it right before the pandemic. So you had a kind of unexpected terrain to deal with, as we all did, I guess.
Well, first of all, thank you for having us, because this is a great opportunity to do some belated promotion for the book. When the book came out in 2020, we had our book release party here in Syracuse, and literally like 2 or 3 weeks later, we were already in lockdown. So I'm glad that the book is getting out there and that people are finding it. The idea came to us, I think, when we were actually talking about Mulholland Drive, not even Twin Peaks directly. And if I can pay Julie a compliment here, one of the best pieces of scholarship that I'd ever read on Mulholland Drive came from Julie's book, Rethinking the Femme Fatale in Film Noir. Julie and I were already friends. We both live and work here in Syracuse, New York, and we were meeting to actually talk about an article that I was writing at the time on Mulholland Drive. And through the conversation, we realized that we both had really similar takes on that film, on David Lynch, on Lynch's work in neo-noir, on Twin Peaks. And we thought, it'd be great to collaborate on a publication on Twin Peaks. And the return, I think, had just come out. And so we thought, well, if we're going to do this, we might want to do it now, because if we wait any longer, everybody's going to be trying to pitch a book on Twin Peaks. So we knew about this series at Wayne State University Press, the TV Milestone series, and it's dedicated to short monographs, each of which covers an individual TV show. And it's aimed at kind of a crossover audience of academics and fans. So we thought we'd start there because that seemed like an ideal venue, and pitched it to the editor. And thankfully, the editor was interested, and off we went. I think we pretty much just blocked off that summer and wrote furiously together and got it done at the end of that summer.
And that was 2019, or
it might have even been 2018 when we hatched the idea to do this, because I think The Return was either currently on the air or it had just ended. And so I think the idea to do this came in 2018, and that's when we pitched the book. We wrote it in 2019, and then it came out in 2020.
Now, Julie, what was your, if you can give it away, I guess, what was your idea about Mulholland Drive that started that connection going?
I loved Mulholland Drive, as I know Will does, as a kind of revisionist noir in my mind. And I was particularly interested in the sort of deconstruction of the femme fatale figure, in part through the film's homage to Sunset Boulevard. And so the chapter is actually about Sunset Boulevard and Mulholland Drive. But I think largely due to the unbelievable performance by Naomi Watts, the kind of anatomizing of the bad woman in that film is just fascinating. So it gives us sort of two stories of female agency. And, you know, I had read so many things about Mulholland Drive that focused on its ambiguity. And to me, it seemed just kind of strangely crystal clear that the film was about, well, it's about a lot of things, but it was about this woman's dreaming of a different life for herself, having endured the sort of trauma of Hollywood. And again, it resonated with the story of Norma Desmond, as played by Gloria Swanson in Sunset Boulevard. And we know that David Lynch is enamored of Sunset Boulevard, even from Twin Peaks and The Return. I don't know, that was sort of my take on Mulholland Drive, is to try to delineate what I thought was going on there, because the movie really spoke to me, particularly in the context of writing a book about women in film noir. Yeah, and I also want to give a shout out to Will's great article that subsequently came out on Mulholland Drive, that came out in, it was Film Criticism, right, Will?
That's right. Yeah. And that was 2018 when that came out.
Yeah, so we bonded over Mulholland Drive. And as Will said, The Return had just been broadcast. So we had a lot to talk about. And, you know, it was interesting, too. One of the things that, you know, that we talked a lot about was what kind of intervention we would want to make if we wrote a book on Twin Peaks. And there were two things that we kept coming back to. And, well, a few things that we kept coming back to. One was this idea of women and agency, building on the work that I had done on the figure of the femme fatale, thinking about the charismatic and intelligent women in Twin Peaks, and wanting to explore that. We were interested in bringing Mark Frost more into the story. Obviously, David Lynch's signature is all over Twin Peaks, but they are equal partners in the creation of the show. And so that was something else we were interested in. We also wanted to talk about performance because we were both so struck by how significant, how central performance is in the show in Twin Peaks and The Return. So, yeah.
I thought that was something really interesting about the book, that it's a very slender book from the look of it, but very densely packed. And you had, what was it, 5 or 6? I can look at it right here, 5 or 6 chapters, and each had a different theme. As you say, there's sort of an underlying thread running through it, but in a way you were able to kind of, and instead of saying this is going to be the such and such take on Twin Peaks, you kind of got to fold in these different frameworks. So was there a point where you thought maybe you would focus on just one, or was it always from the beginning, as you said, that we're going to focus on the performance and the femme fatale idea, the genre aspect, the paratext that you talk about at the end? Like, was there always that idea that it would be sort of a bit of an omnibus for all of those themes?
Yeah, all of those chapters were in the proposal that we
Mhm.
submitted because we had to outline the book, and we wound up, I think, biting off more than we were able to chew because there's a fairly low word limit for the TV Milestones books, at least low compared to the traditional academic monographs that the press publishes. So we were going to do a chapter, I think. The book is 5 chapters with an introduction. I think we were going to do a 6th chapter about the fan cultures surrounding Twin Peaks, and we wound
Ah,
up losing that idea just because so much work on Twin Peaks had already covered that. So we thought that seemed like maybe we just don't need that in the book because I would say probably the majority of the scholarship on Twin Peaks within TV studies has looked at fan reception and fan cultures and subcultures. So yeah, those 5 chapters were in the proposal. And I think probably the first idea that we had was that middle chapter on the femme fatale, derived from Julie's book on the femme fatale in film noir. And then I think it probably grew out from there because we were like, okay, well, then we should probably also have a chapter that deals with genre because the femme fatale is often linked to film noir. The performance styles in Twin Peaks are often linked to soap opera and melodrama. So we thought, okay, we should probably have a chapter that deals with the different genres that people have put the show into and the intertextual references that the show is making to different genre films, be it Rebel Without a Cause in the family melodrama or Sunset Boulevard and Laura in film noir. And then Julie's also really interested in adaptation studies, and I think I don't want to speak for. I mean, Julie would probably put this better than I can, but I think Julie was really interested in the way that Twin Peaks kind of splintered out, and there were all these paratext that may not have been as interesting as the our primary text, which was the show, but taken together actually made the show that much more interesting because the story kept unfolding through the secret diary of Laura Palmer and Mark Frost's dossiers and Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, which we both have a very strong connection to. I think that's something else that Julie and I bonded over initially was how powerful that film was for us in terms of the significance of Twin Peaks. I think sort of synced for us in that film, and then the return is indebted so strongly to that film that it became almost impossible to talk about Twin Peaks the show without talking about Twin Peaks the film. So I think that's how that chapter got started, and then we wanted just an opening chapter that dealt with the production context because I think there's a lot of assumptions and misinformation out there about who is responsible for what in Twin Peaks, what David Lynch gets credit for versus what Mark Frost gets credit for. And, we thought that might be a good way to just give readers a general overview of the making of the show is dealing with the collaboration between Lynch and Frost. So it kind of became this organic thing where one piece would lead to another. And I think once we took a step back from the book, we realized that in many ways, each of the chapters is about adaptation in some way, breaking down boundaries between texts, between media, between authors, even the performances themselves. Often a single performer will be playing sort of multiple different roles. And so that I think became the frame that emerged once we had sort of drafts of each of the chapters.
I really like all of that. I think that's really well said. And especially to this idea of breaking boundaries, which, as Will says, seems to relate to all of the chapters of the book. And this notion of objectification, which we were trying to work against in connection with the femme fatale and with, the idea of a text called Twin Peaks, which it turns out is expansive. And so it can't be objectified or found in only one place or one text, or the sort of boundary breaking nature of the performances.
I'd like to zoom in a little bit on that, on the noir aspect in particular. I feel like it kind of anchors the book in a way, and it's very interesting to find out that it sounds like that was kind of the impetus in a way, that particularly the idea of the femme fatale, and then the other things sort of grew from there because you started with this concept, but how much you felt like you discovered through that process of looking at it through the noir lens, because I felt there was a lot of stuff that you talked about, even just things like the motifs. I'd never really thought about how many dining or drinking places there are in Twin Peaks. They have a feeling of transience to them. They're not, the closest you have is to sort of a stable type of place like that would probably be the diner. And even that, a diner you think of as somewhere that you kind of pass through. So they're all diners and roadhouses and just not that anchored. I think the most anchored bar we probably see that feels the least like a sort of transient space is probably where we meet Diane, that sort of plush bar, and she's one of the least stable characters in a sense, so it's kind of ironic. But can you talk a little bit about exploring the motifs and other aspects of the show through a noir lens, and what that brought to you, starting from that place of the femme fatale and broadening out?
One of the things that really interested both of us about Twin Peaks was the way it sort of, to use your word, destabilized the character patterns that we associate with classic film noir. So certainly with regard to the hard-boiled detective, down these mean streets a man must go, Dale Cooper is quite different. Other things have been written about the sort of the feminine aspect of Dale Cooper and his intuitive qualities, and how that revises this notion of the kind of hyper-rational detective who is trapped in the past. And, contrast that with Cooper's sort of being always in the present and his openness to moments and to cherry pie and to coffee and to the Douglas firs. Analogously, the femme fatale was also a kind of change up from the sort of classic film noir representation of the deadly seductress who destroys the men she seduces and then eventually herself is destroyed herself because of production codes. I think for me, the charisma of the women in Twin Peaks, Audrey Horne's dance, and most centrally, I think for both Will and me, Laura Palmer's subjectivity, which on the surface is elided when you think about, the association of Laura Palmer with a picture, with the photograph, the homecoming queen photograph. But in fact, as the story world develops and expands in Twin Peaks and then in the paratext, there's a fairly profound subjectivity and story of yearning and desire and trauma that Laura's story taps into. And I think that the character patterns in classic noir and how the show changes them up in relation to the men and the women of film noir, I think that really was an important exploration that we wanted to undertake in the book. There's a lot else to say about noir and the show, but
I totally agree with everything that Julie just said. And in fact, as what I might call like a second generation Twin Peaks fan, in other words, I didn't see the show. I was too young to have seen the show when it aired in 1990. So I came to it after the cult classic status had already been established. And I think I first heard about the show in relationship to neo-noir in the 90s and TV noir. And so I was already kind of looking for those connections when I first saw Twin Peaks. And I think it was when it was streaming on CBS.com. I was in grad school at the time. And so it was like, oh, okay, there's a reference to Sunset Boulevard, and there's a reference to Laura, and there's a reference to Out of the Past and Double Indemnity. And then I think that's why I was drawn to those kind of classic noir spaces of the diner. In fact, the diner in the film noir, The Postman Always Rings Twice, is actually called the Twin Oaks Cafe. And so seeing all of those connections unfold as I was working my way through the show, I thought, it's interesting how it's both noir and not noir. It challenges and expands on these tropes of the hard-boiled detective or the femme fatale, but then in other ways it seems very invested in noir style and noir storytelling. It takes noir and I think also melodrama very seriously, and that was something we also wanted to do with the book, is push back against this assumption that Lynch is a kind of postmodern ironist who just sort of mines popular culture from the middle of the 20th century to make fun of it in this mocking way. There is an element of humor in Twin Peaks, and it's kind of hard to describe exactly what that humor is doing. But I don't think that it's making fun of, say, noir films from the 40s or soap operas. And so I think by working with the intertexts and the genre precursors to Twin Peaks, Julie and I were trying to figure out what is it doing in earnest, as opposed to how is Lynch making fun of these things, sending them up as subjects of camp parody.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I noticed that was something strongly stressed in the book as well. This idea that, yes, of course, there is a certain pastiche, self-conscious quality about it, but there's also a sincerity that I think is appreciated more now than maybe it was at the time. I actually had an interesting exchange with someone recently who watched it. I'm in the same boat as you. Well, I was too young to watch it at the time and caught up with it later, but they were, I think, a teenager, and they said they weren't that familiar with some of the genres that it was sort of riffing on, and they just took it as, strange but straightforward. And we kind of wondered together if there was a difference with maybe some of the older viewers, like I'm talking like like boomers, basically, people who would have been in their 30s or 40s at the time, and their default mode was, this is kind of hip knowing irony.
Yes.
And that as the younger generation caught into it more, maybe that went away. My other obsession besides Twin Peaks is generations and eras and all of that. So that, that was right up my alley, that interpretation.
That's fascinating. I hadn't even thought of that until you just mentioned that. I do think there's a generational difference, because so many of my students, when they discover Twin Peaks or really any of David Lynch's work, they don't read it at all through that lens of irony, or, I mean, there are certain ironic elements, but they don't see it as him being hip and wink wink, I'm making fun of this, we're all in on the joke. They take it very earnestly. And it was more so people my age that Twin Peaks and like David Lynch also take it earnestly. It was more that first generation of academic scholarship in the early 90s, partly because I think of the age of the people that were writing that scholarship. Their reading strategy may have been postmodernism, because that framework was so in vogue in academia, in the humanities in the early 90s, that it seemed like it lent itself very readily to a kind of postmodern or psychoanalytic reading, where that seems, the way it was intended to be read. And Lynch has come out and said later that, no, I never meant it to be, I never meant people to be laughing at the characters or anything like that.
Can I add, as someone who was older and did watch the show as an adult in 1990, I was in graduate school. My sort of affective connection to the show had to do with the presence of all of the actors on television whom I had grown up with. For me, it was all about, oh my goodness, it's Peggy Lipton from the Mod Squad, whose name in the Mod Squad was Julie. So I grew up sort of idolizing Peggy Lipton from the Mod Squad, because I thought she was amazing in that show. And Michael Onkeen from The Rookies, who was playing Harry S. Truman in Twin Peaks, and even, and the callbacks to The Fugitive, which I had probably watched in reruns when I was younger. Russ Tamblyn from, reruns of Peyton Place I had seen. And even in the second season, seeing Michael Parks, who had been in Then Came Bronson. I think he played the villain Jean Reno with that really cheesy French accent. So for me, that was part of my my kind of emotional connection to the show. And when you think about then coming back to The Return, all these years later, that emotion then gets multiplied because it's the same actors, and it's kind of uncanny to then see Peggy Lipton again. And now it's not Michael Onkeen, but it's Robert Forster playing his brother Frank Truman. But Forster was also a TV star in the 70s with Banyan. So I think, that identification with at least my generation of viewers with the show in terms of TV history was definitely part of it.
What's interesting, Julie, is we've had this conversation before where you were talking about, Peggy Lipton and that generation of actors that then almost has a new lease on their career in Twin Peaks at this later stage in their career. I think you're the only person that I've ever had that conversation with. So many people never talked about that in that early scholarship that was coming out on Twin Peaks in the 90s. Those sorts of intertexts seem to be off the table. People were latching more onto the explicit references to Laura or small town Norman Rockwell Portrait of America. But I don't remember people talking about those some of those supporting actors being sources of a kind of affective power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was definitely experiencing it as a fan at that time and not as a scholar.
It seems to me that one of the interesting things that happened, I would say around the mid 90s, I think Martha Nachemson especially, but also Diane Stevenson, some of those writers who were in the book Full of Secrets,
Mm-hmm.
from like the mid 90s that the late David Lavery edited. That collection, I think, started to take the discussion, and I don't think there was much that I've seen before that, started to take it in an interesting direction where I think the critique of it before, when it had been written about from, say, a feminist angle or focusing on the female characters, it had been more critical, like the essay in Ms. and stuff like that. And
Mm-hmm.
what they did was they took actually a more sort of sympathetic look at it. And I feel like this book, I would say, continues that tradition, both with the looking at it through the femme fatale lens and also just wider. I'm curious to hear about that from you guys, but also what you think about season 3's role in that, because I have some thoughts on that we may sort of dig into and explore in the especially in the back part of this conversation when we get to that. But to start off with, when you were working with ideas from previous writing on Twin Peaks and sort of exploring that angle, I guess, how did that play out for you?
Yeah, I would say that Will and I were both very influenced by that Martha Nachemson essay in that volume, because she wrote this really important essay on the sort of gender boundaries, the dissolution of gender boundaries in the show, focusing on Cooper. So I definitely think we, are sort of working in the tradition of that critique of the show that is more positive about the representations of gender, or at least interested in the openness in the show in terms of its view of gender. And I'm really interested to hear what you were thinking about when you were talking about the return, because for me, the characters in the return, like Sarah Palmer, as played by Grace Zabriskie, and Laura Dern's portrayal of Diane, really, and I should say Naomi Watts too, as Janie E, really carry forth the sort of representation of strong, charismatic, and smart women that we saw, in Audrey Horne and in Laura as well.
Yeah, and to kind of go back to the topic of adaptation, which we touched on earlier, when I mentioned how, as interesting as Twin Peaks, the 1990 to 1991 show is on its own, I think it's enriched by all of these different paratexts, some more so than others. And I think if you just look at the first two seasons, you're kind of getting an incomplete picture of just what the show does do with these female characters. There's interesting stuff in those first two seasons, in particular with Audrey Horne, I think is one of the most interesting characters. But then Fire Walk with Me brings Laura's story to the foreground in such a powerful way that I can't even watch the first two seasons of Twin Peaks without thinking about Fire Walk with Me. So that becomes part of my experience of watching the first two seasons of Twin Peaks. And then now with the return, it's the same thing. And so I think the addition of those new female characters and the sort of layers that we get with some of the older characters that are brought into focus in a way that we hadn't seen, I think makes the show way more complicated than some of those initial readings might suggest. I found some of those earlier readings fairly reductive in the interpretations of how Lynch was representing those female characters, and I think that I'm sure that The Return has its detractors as well, but I definitely think it complicates some of those readings in a way that just looking at Twin Peaks as one discrete thing, it doesn't do the show justice, I think.
Right. And if I could just add, I think that's really important, and sort of makes me think about how fascinating it is that later iterations of the Twin Peaks world give you a different perspective on what's happened in the earlier texts. So here's a minor example. I never really was that engaged with the character of Lucy, and yet thinking so much about the issue of girls and women trapped in this landscape, and the themes of desire, female desire, that made me go back to a storyline that I didn't love in season 2 with Richard Tremaine, romantic triangle. And there's this one moment when Lucy says something about Richard Tremaine, like, most of his behavior was asinine, but at least he was different. And in the context of thinking about ambitious women who want more than, their immediate lives are able to offer them, that takes on a new meaning. Even things like Cheryl Lee doing the audiobook, Secret Diary of Laura Palmer, and how that kind of profoundly, I think, affects your reading of the earlier texts with Laura. And that's, relatively recent. It's interesting how, as readers and scholars, we are adapting our view of the show based on the expanding story world.
Yeah, and that's something that TV can do in a really interesting way because of the long form storytelling. I mean, even within the original first 2 seasons of Twin Peaks, there'll be like a line of dialogue, or not even a subplot, but just a kind of glimpse that we get into another character that then will cause me to reread that character in a way that allows me to appreciate them. For example, Catherine Martell was never a character that I was really all that interested in. That storyline was not, I didn't find it as compelling as some of the other storylines. But then there's this line, I think, Julie, you were the one that even pointed it out when we were working on the book, when after Josie vanishes, she says something like, Josie did what she had to do. I can't remember the exact line. It's like Josie did what she had to do or something. Because all along there's this sort of antagonistic relationship between Catherine and Josie. And then all of a sudden you see that there's this weird admiration that she had for her, a kind of sympathy that she had for her that actually made Catherine then in retrospect much more interesting. And so when I've gone back to rewatch it, that's something I've paid attention to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a really interesting moment.
Before we pivot a little into some of these questions about season 3, and I'm really curious to hear what you guys think about my thoughts about it, some of which I feel like was fed by your book as well, some of the ideas that kind of came from it. Before we get to that, we'll probably be doing a segue here. I may rearrange some of the material, but around this point. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to just remind people of the book, where they should get it, and what you're up to, where to find you online, and so forth, before we shift to the patron part.
So the book is just simply called Twin Peaks, and it's part of the TV Milestone series that Wayne State University Press publishes. It was published in 2020, and you can order it off the Wayne State University Press website. You can order it off Barnes and Nobles, Amazon, any major online book retailer should have it. And in terms of where people can find me, I teach at Syracuse University in the English department. I'm an associate professor, and I teach the film and screen studies classes. And I have a website, willscheibel.com, and I'm on Twitter. It's Calling Barranca is the handle, which is a reference to Only Angels Have Wings. And I don't know if people listening to this can see the Zoom screen. That's what the movie is that I have it as my profile picture.
Cary Grant on the horn.
Yep, exactly. And what I'm up to, I just finished a book on the actress Jean Tierney, who played the title character in Laura, which is one of the Twin Peaks intertexts, and that'll be out in September from Wayne State University Press.
And I was fortunate enough to get an advance view of that book, and it is amazing. So as soon as it's available, I think it's available for pre-order pretty soon. So everybody should get a copy of Will's book on Jean Tierney. I am at Lemoyne College in Syracuse, and I'm on Twitter. My handle is at Julie Grossman 1. And in terms of what I'm up to, I'm working on a book with Barton Palmer on performance in film noir, to sort of shift the focus in noir studies from character patterns and other icons of film noir to the performers who peopled the films in the classic film noir series. And Will and I are also co-editing a book on the Showtime television show Penny Dreadful. So hopefully that will be out late this year or next year. And that's been really fun to sort of continue collaborating.
Mm-hmm.
Great. All right. Well, thank you. And now we will, I guess, move forward with the discussion for those who are on the patron tier. So one thing I wanted to build on from what you were talking about is, and of course, to hear the rest of this conversation, check out the Patreon link in the show notes below on patreon.com/lostinthemovies. You can become a $5 a month patron to hear the full Twin Peaks conversations every month. It's a great reward to kind of dig into that, not just what's going up month to month, but also take a look into the archive, the backlog of those, and also of other podcasts that haven't been made publicly available yet. So thanks for listening. Make sure you buy this book. I've got the link in the show notes. It's got lots more great discussion on these topics that we started to dig into here.